The courthouse doors swing open and Nancy Kim steps into Seoul's autumn sunlight. Behind her, the building holds the wreckage of Baek Siwon's empire. Ahead of her, cameras flash like lightning, reporters surge forward like a wave, and somewhere in the chaos, justice settles into her bones with a weight she didn't expect. "Ms. Kim! Ms. Kim!" A reporter shoves a microphone toward her face. "How does it feel to win?" Nancy adjusts the strap of her leather portfolio, the same one she's carried for 6 years. The same one that holds every piece of evidence that brought Baek Siwon to his knees. "I'm relieved the court recognized the safety violations," she says calmly. "But this was personal, wasn't it?" Another reporter pushes closer. "He stole your work 5 years ago. Destroyed your career. Is this revenge?" The question hangs in the air. Revenge. Such a simple word for something so complicated. Nancy looks directly into the camera. This was accountability. There's a difference. She walks down the courthouse steps, and the reporters part like water. Her heels click against stone with a rhythm that sounds like victory, though victory tastes different than she imagined. Less sweet. More like medicine, bitter but necessary. "Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now telling me, have you ever had to choose between revenge and justice? Hit that like button because what Nancy did to bring down her former boss is going to blow your mind. And subscribe, because this story has twists you won't see coming. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next." A black car waits at the curb. Not hers. She takes the subway now, by choice, not necessity. The car belongs to the prosecution team, offering her a ride she doesn't need. Nancy waves them off and heads toward Gwangwoman Station, disappearing into the crowd of afternoon commuters who have no idea they're walking past the woman who just dismantled one of Seoul's most prominent real estate developers. Inside the courthouse, Baek Siwon sits in an empty courtroom with his lawyer, staring at the table where the verdict was read 30 minutes ago. Criminal negligence. Fraud. Bribery of building inspectors. 18 counts. Guilty on 16 of them. His lawyer is saying something about appeals, about mitigating factors, about sentencing recommendations. Siwon doesn't hear any of it. He's thinking about a woman who worked for him 6 years ago. A woman he barely remembers firing. A woman who just ended everything he built. How did this happen? The answer lies 6 months earlier, in a small design studio in Seongsu-dong, where Nancy Kim was about to receive an offer that would change everything. "The client wants to meet you personally." Nancy looked up from her desk where she'd been reviewing material samples for a cafe renovation. Her boss, Mrs. Huang, stood in the doorway holding a file folder with the kind of careful excitement that meant big money. "What client?" "Lotus Holdings. They're developing a luxury hotel in Gangnam. 200 rooms, rooftop restaurant, spa, the whole package. Budget is essentially unlimited." Mrs. Huang set the folder on Nancy's desk. "They specifically requested you after seeing your work on the Jeju Resort project." Nancy opened the folder, her heart rate steady despite the significance of what she was reading. Lotus Holdings. She'd never heard of them, which wasn't unusual. Wealthy investors often operated through shell corporations for tax purposes, privacy, liability protection. The paperwork listed a registered agent, a law firm address, no individual names. "When's the meeting?" "Tomorrow. 10 a.m. Their office in Jongno." Nancy flipped through the project brief. Luxury hotel. High-end finishes. Target demographic, international business travelers and wealthy tourists. Timeline, 18 months from design approval to opening. It was ambitious. It was also exactly the kind of project she used to dream about. Used to. Before. "I'll be there," Nancy said. That night, she sat in her small apartment in Yeonnam-dong and researched Lotus Holdings. The company was registered 8 months ago. No website. No press releases. No public information beyond the basic corporate registration. Just a law firm address and a bank account. This wasn't unusual, but it wasn't common either. Most developers wanted publicity. Wanted their names attached to luxury projects. Wanted the prestige. Nancy closed her laptop and looked at the wall across from her desk. Pinned there were photographs. Building permits. Inspection reports. News articles. A map of Seoul with red pins marking locations. And in the center, a single photograph of a man in an expensive suit standing in front of a building, smiling for a magazine cover. Baek Siwon. She'd been tracking him for 5 years. Every project. Every building. Every corner cut and regulation bent. She knew his methods better than his own project managers. Knew which inspectors he bribed. Knew which subcontractors used substandard materials. Knew exactly how he built his reputation on stolen work and dangerous buildings. Knew that eventually, he'd make a mistake big enough that she could use it. Nancy pulled the Lotus Holdings folder closer. Something about this felt off. The timing. The secrecy. The unlimited budget. She opened her laptop again and dug deeper. The law firm listed as Lotus Holdings registered agent specialized in real estate development. Their client list was private, but Nancy had spent 5 years building connections in Seoul's construction industry. She made 3 phone calls. The third one paid off. Lotus Holdings? Her contact, a paralegal at a competing firm, sounded amused. That's one of Baek Siwon's shell companies. He uses it for projects he wants to keep off Baek Development's official books. Usually means he's planning something aggressive. Hostile acquisition, maybe, or testing a new market. Nancy's pulse quickened. You're sure? Positive. I processed some of the paperwork last month. After hanging up, Nancy sat in the dark of her apartment, thinking. Baek Siwon wanted to hire her. He didn't know it yet, didn't know who she was, but he was about to put his next major project in her hands. The universe had a sense of irony. Nancy pulled out a separate laptop, the one she used for research, for planning, for the identity she'd built over 5 years of preparation. She opened encrypted files containing everything she knew about Baek Siwon's projects. Every shortcut. Every bribed inspector. Every substandard material. Every code violation. She'd been waiting for the right opportunity. And now it had walked through her door. Pause right here for a second. What do you think Nancy's planning? Drop your prediction in the comments because I guarantee you're not going to see all the layers of what she's about to do. Hit that subscribe button because this gets so much more complex than you think. The next morning, Nancy arrived at the Lotus Holdings office at 9:55 a.m. The building was new, all glass and steel and expensive minimalism in Jangneo's business district. She wore clothes that cost more than she made in a month, an investment she'd made 3 years ago when she returned to Seoul. Appearance mattered in this industry. People needed to believe you were successful before they'd hire you to create success. The receptionist, young and polished, led her to a conference room on the 14th floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Baekhyun Mountain in the distance. The table was black marble. The chairs were Italian leather. Everything screamed money. They'll be with you shortly, the receptionist said and left. Nancy set down her portfolio and walked to the window. Seoul sprawled below, a city of 10 million people living in buildings designed by people like her. Buildings that should be safe. Should be beautiful. Should be built with integrity. Should be. The door opened behind her. Ms. Kim. Thank you for coming. Nancy turned slowly, her expression professionally pleasant, her heart rate controlled. She'd practiced this moment in her mind 1,000 times. Baek Siwon looked exactly like his photographs. 42 years old but could pass for 35. Expensive suit, expensive watch, expensive smile. He was flanked by 2 other men, probably his development director and project manager, both wearing slightly less expensive versions of everything he was wearing. Nancy extended her hand, her grip firm and confident. Mr. Baek. It's a pleasure. His handshake was exactly what she expected, firm, brief, already moving on to the next thing. His eyes scanned her face for exactly 2 seconds before moving to her portfolio. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? The Nancy Kim he'd fired 6 years ago had long hair and glasses and 20 extra pounds and wore cheap clothes and looked at him like he was a god. This Nancy Kim looked nothing like that woman. I've been impressed with your work, Siwon said, gesturing for her to sit. The Jeju Resort project showed exceptional attention to detail. Exactly what we're looking for. Thank you. Nancy sat, crossed her legs, projected the confidence she'd earned through 6 years of clawing her way back from nothing. I understand you're planning a hotel in Gangnam. Correct. Saiwon sat across from her, his posture relaxed, assured. 200 rooms, luxury positioning, 18-month timeline. We have the property secured. Construction permits are in process. We need a designer who can create something memorable. Something that will establish Lotus Holdings as a serious player in Seoul's luxury market. Nancy pulled out her tablet, called up preliminary concepts she'd created last night, concepts that were beautiful, ambitious, and if she was very careful, comprehensively flawed in ways only a thorough building inspection would reveal. I have some initial thoughts, she said, turning the tablet toward them. Obviously, these would need refinement based on your specific requirements and the property constraints. She watched Saiwon lean forward, watched his eyes scan the designs. Beautiful lobby with dramatic double-height ceilings. Rooftop infinity pool that would require structural reinforcements most contractors would cut corners on. Cantilevered restaurant that would test load-bearing calculations. Every element was designed to look spectacular and to tempt shortcuts. This is exactly the vision we had, Saiwon said, and Nancy heard the greed in his voice. The design was expensive. He'd want to find ways to make it cheaper without losing the aesthetic. How quickly can you have complete design documents ready? 6 weeks for schematic design. Another 6 for design development. Then construction documents. Too long. Saiwon shook his head. We need to break ground in 3 months. Can you compress the timeline? Nancy pretended to consider this, though she'd anticipated the request. Compressed timelines meant rushed work. Rushed work meant mistakes. Mistakes were what she was counting on. I can deliver schematic design in 4 weeks if I prioritize this project, she said. But that would require your team to be responsive on decision-making. Any delays on your end will push everything back. That won't be a problem. Saiwon smiled the smile of a man who'd never been told no. We have a very streamlined approval process. Just me, really. Just him. Even better. No oversight. No checks and balances. Just Baek Saiwon making decisions the way he always did, fast, aggressive, and cutting every corner that wouldn't show from the outside. Then I can work with that timeline, Nancy said. They discussed fees. Nancy quoted 20% higher than her usual rate, expecting negotiation. Saiwon agreed immediately, which told her the budget was even larger than she'd thought. Which meant he'd be cutting costs somewhere else. Somewhere invisible. Somewhere structural. Exactly as she'd planned. The meeting ended with handshakes and promises of contracts by end of week. Nancy left the building and walked 3 blocks before allowing herself to feel anything. Then she ducked into a coffee shop, ordered an Americano she didn't drink, and sat in the back corner, hands shaking. 6 years? 6 years of planning, of positioning herself, of building a reputation good enough that Baek Saiwon would hire her. And now she was in. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. Contract sent to your email. Welcome to the team. BS. Nancy opened her secure email on her phone and scrolled through the contract. Standard terms. Generous payment schedule. And buried on page 7, a clause she'd expected. All design work became property of Lotus Holdings upon payment. Meaning Baek Saiwon could take her designs, modify them, claim them as his own if he wanted. Just like he'd done 6 years ago. Nancy remembered that day with crystal clarity. She'd been 24, fresh out of graduate school with a master's in architecture from Yonsei University. Baek Development had been her dream job. And for 8 months, she'd believed she was living that dream. She'd been assigned to the Hanam District residential project. Luxury apartments targeting wealthy families. Her first major project, and she'd poured everything into it. Designed every detail. The flowing facade that maximized natural light. The communal rooftop garden that created community. The sustainable materials that reduced environmental impact. She presented it to Saiwon herself, nervous and proud in equal measure. He'd looked at her work for maybe 3 minutes. Then he'd said, "The facade is too expensive. The rooftop garden takes up sellable space. And sustainability costs money we don't need to spend. Redo it." Nancy had tried to explain. The facade was the signature element. The garden was what made the building special. The sustainability was what made it responsible. Saiwon had cut her off. I don't pay you to argue. I pay you to design what I tell you to design. Do it again, or I'll find someone who will. She'd done it again. Stripped away everything that made it special. Made it generic and forgettable and cheap. 2 weeks later, she'd seen her original designs in a magazine. The Hanam District project was moving forward with everything she'd created. Her facade. Her garden. Her sustainable materials. But the designer listed was Park Jin-woo, a senior architect at Beck Development who'd been with the company for 15 years. Nancy had confronted Saiwon. Huge mistake. You think you designed that? Saiwon had laughed, actually laughed. You're an employee. Everything you create belongs to the company. And frankly, your original designs needed significant refinement by someone with actual experience. Jin-woo fixed your amateur mistakes. You should be grateful your work was salvageable. Those were my designs. Every element. Every detail. I have the original files, which are company property. Saiwon's smile had vanished. Covered in your employment contract, which I'm sure you read before signing. Now are you finished wasting my time? Nancy had gone to HR, filed a complaint, provided evidence. And 3 days later, she'd been fired for performance issues and unprofessional conduct. Her career had ended before it began. Beck Development was one of Seoul's biggest developers. When other firms called for references, they were told Nancy Kim was difficult, unprofessional, had delusions about her contributions. No one would hire her. She'd spent 2 years in Busan, working for a small firm that did residential renovations. 2 years rebuilding her reputation from scratch. 2 years watching Beck Saiwon win awards for her designs. Then she'd come back to Seoul with a plan. Now, sitting in a coffee shop in Jongyo, Nancy opened the contract from Lotus Holdings and read it carefully. She had her lawyer review it. She negotiated exactly 3 minor points to make it look legitimate. And then she signed. 4 weeks later, Nancy delivered the schematic designs for the Gangnam Hotel. They were beautiful. They were ambitious. And they were a trap. The structural engineering was complex enough that it required expertise most contractors didn't have. The material specifications were just vague enough that cheaper alternatives could be substituted. The load calculations were accurate but assumed perfect execution with zero tolerance for error. In the hands of a responsible developer with quality contractors and proper oversight, the design would create something spectacular and safe. In Beck Saiwon's hands, it would create a disaster waiting to happen. Nancy watched him review the designs in a meeting room identical to the one where they'd first met. She watched him love every expensive detail. Watched him mentally calculate how much money he could save by cutting corners she'd carefully left exposed. This is perfect, Saiwon said, and Nancy heard the future in his voice. The cheap materials he'd substitute. The inexperienced contractors he'd underpay. The inspectors he'd bribe to overlook violations. She knew because she'd studied his methods for 5 years. Knew exactly how he'd tried to save money. And she'd designed every vulnerability to document itself. I'm glad you're pleased, Nancy said. Shall we discuss the design development phase? Actually, Saiwon leaned back in his chair. I'm wondering if we need that phase. These designs are clear enough for construction documents. If we skip ahead, we could start construction in 6 weeks instead of 3 months. Nancy had expected this. Skipping design development meant no detailed refinement, no problem solving, no error checking. It meant rushing straight to construction with designs that hadn't been fully vetted. That's aggressive, Nancy said carefully. Design development is where we resolve technical challenges, coordinate with engineers, ensure constructability. We have experienced contractors. Saiwon interrupted. They can figure it out. What I need from you is construction documents in 4 weeks. Can you do that? Nancy pretended to hesitate, though this was exactly what she wanted. It's possible, but I'd need to flag potential issues for the contractors to resolve during construction. That's fine. They're professionals. They can handle it. They finalized the compressed timeline, and Nancy left with another piece of the trap set. Rushed construction documents. Inexperienced contractors working without proper guidance. technical challenges deferred to people who wouldn't understand them. Over the next 4 weeks, Nancy created construction documents that were technically accurate but practically incomplete. She specified structural requirements without detailed execution guidance, listed materials by performance standards without specific products, created complex details without step-by-step assembly instructions. Any competent contractor would flag the gaps and ask questions. Any responsible developer would slow down and fill in the missing pieces. But Baek Siwon had never been responsible. Construction began in May. Nancy wasn't officially involved in the construction phase, typical for designers on fast-track projects. But she'd built enough relationships in Seoul's construction industry that information flowed to her anyway. The foundation contractor was new, underbid by 30%, had never worked on a project this large. They misread the structural drawings and poured footings 6 inches shallower than specified. The steel fabricator substituted a cheaper grade of steel that met code minimums, but not the design requirements for the cantilevered restaurant. The concrete supplier used excessive water content to make the mix easier to work with, weakening the final strength. Every shortcut was technically a code violation. Every violation was documented in inspection reports that were signed off anyway by an inspector Nancy knew had been taking money from Baek Development for years. Nancy collected it all. Photographs from construction workers willing to talk. Copies of materials receipts showing substitutions. Inspection reports with falsified approvals. Structural calculations showing the as-built conditions didn't match the design requirements. She compiled everything in encrypted files, cross-referenced and dated, a comprehensive record of every code violation and safety issue in the Gangnam Hotel project. And she waited. The hotel's structural frame went up in July. The facade installation started in August. Interior construction began in September. Every phase revealed new problems, new shortcuts, new violations. The project was now 3 months behind schedule and $2 million over budget, even with all the cost cutting. Stop right here, beautiful people. Do you see what Nancy's doing? This isn't just about revenge, this is strategy. Drop a comment telling me if you think her plan is going to work, and hit that subscribe button because what happens next is going to leave you speechless. The moment where everything comes together. You won't believe it. In October, Nancy received a call from someone she'd been expecting. Ms. Kim? This is Detective Park from the Seoul Metropolitan Police Construction Fraud Unit. Do you have time to answer some questions about the Gangnam Lotus Hotel project? Nancy's heart rate didn't spike. She'd been preparing for this call for months. Of course. Would you like to meet in person? They met in a cafe in 81, far from both Baek Development's offices and Nancy's studio. Detective Park was mid-40s, tired eyes, the look of someone who'd seen too many developers cut corners and get away with it. We've received reports of possible code violations at the Gangnam site, he said, pulling out a notebook. Your name is on the construction documents as the designer of record. Can you tell me about your involvement in the project? Nancy had practiced this conversation 100 times. She pulled out her tablet and opened files containing every email, every meeting note, every design decision documented with timestamps and recipients. I was hired to design the hotel in March, she said. I delivered schematic designs in April and construction documents in May. The timeline was compressed at the client's request. I flagged multiple technical issues that required resolution during construction phase. Those flags were documented in my transmittal emails to Lotus Holdings. She showed him the emails. Showed him where she'd specified structural requirements. Where she noted that certain details needed engineering review. Where she'd recommended materials by performance standards rather than specific products. Did you observe any code violations during construction? Detective Park asked. I wasn't retained for construction administration, Nancy said. That's not unusual on fast-track projects, though it's not best practice. I wasn't on site, wasn't reviewing contractor work, wasn't part of the construction process. But you've heard things. Nancy met his eyes. I've heard things. Would you be willing to share what you've heard? This was the moment. The point of no return. Nancy could walk away, let the investigation proceed without her active involvement, stay safe and anonymous. But she hadn't spent 5 years planning this to stay safe. I'd be willing to share documentation I've collected, Nancy said. Photographs, materials receipts, inspection reports, structural calculations showing as-built conditions versus design requirements. If it would help your investigation. Detective Park's tired eyes suddenly looked much more alert. You've been documenting this? As the designer of record, I have a professional and ethical obligation to ensure the building is constructed safely, Nancy said. When I heard about potential violations, I felt I should gather information in case it became relevant. That's unusually proactive. I take my professional responsibility seriously. What Nancy didn't say, that she'd been cultivating relationships with construction workers for 5 years specifically to have eyes inside Baek Si-won's projects. That she'd paid for some of the photographs. That she'd cross-referenced every piece of evidence against code requirements and engineering standards to build an airtight case. Detective Park didn't need to know her motivation. He just needed the evidence. Nancy transferred files to a secure drive. Hundreds of photographs, dozens of documents, material receipts, inspection reports with signatures from Inspector Choi Jin-suk who'd been approving Baek Si-won's projects for 8 years. This is... Detective Park looked stunned. This is comprehensive. I'm thorough, Nancy said. Ms. Kim. Detective Park closed his notebook, his expression serious. If even half of this is accurate, we're looking at criminal negligence charges. Possibly fraud. The developer could face significant penalties. And if anything goes wrong with this building, if someone gets hurt, the designer of record could face liability too. I'm aware, Nancy said calmly. That's why I kept such detailed records. I specified structural requirements that would have made the building safe if followed. I documented when the client requested an aggressive timeline that compromised proper design development. I flagged technical issues that needed attention. If something goes wrong, I have a clear record showing I did my due diligence within the scope of my contracted work. She didn't add, and I designed every vulnerability to document itself. Every shortcut to leave evidence. Every code violation to be discoverable. Because I knew exactly how Baek Si-won would try to save money, and I made sure he'd hang himself in the process. The investigation moved quickly after that. Detective Park brought in structural engineers to review Nancy's evidence. They inspected the hotel site and found exactly what Nancy's documentation suggested: substandard materials, improper construction methods, falsified inspections. The prosecutor's office got involved. Search warrants were executed on Baek Development's offices. Inspector Choi Jin-suk was arrested for accepting bribes. Subcontractors started talking, making deals, providing evidence of a systematic pattern of code violations across multiple Baek Development projects. And then the prosecutors found something Nancy hadn't known about. In Si-won's emails, they found evidence of intellectual property theft. Designs stolen from junior architects, credited to senior staff. Work product claimed as company property and then sold to other developers. A pattern going back 15 years. Including emails about the Hanam District project. Nancy's designs. With Si-won explicitly telling Park Jin-woo to clean up the amateur's work and put your name on it. The prosecutor's office called Nancy in November. Ms. Kim, we'd like you to testify. Nancy sat across from Prosecutor Han Min-jun, a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and an expression that suggested she'd prosecuted hundreds of cases and won most of them. Testify about what specifically? Nancy asked. Everything. Prosecutor Han spread files across the table. The Gangnam Hotel safety violations. The falsified inspections. And the intellectual property theft. We found evidence that Baek Si-won stole your designs for the Hanam District project 6 years ago. If you're willing to testify about that, it establishes a pattern of fraud that significantly strengthens our case. Nancy looked at the files. At her own designs from 6 years ago. At Si-won's emails casually discussing how to erase her contribution. What would my testimony involve? Explaining how you created the Hanam District designs. Providing original files with metadata showing you created them. Testifying about how Baek Si-won stole credit and then fired you when you complained. It's a secondary charge compared to the safety violations, but it demonstrates character. Shows the jury this isn't just about negligence, It's about a man who's been cutting corners and stealing work for over a decade. And if I testify? Your name will be public. Beck Siwon's lawyers will come after you hard. They'll question your motivations, suggest you're bitter about being fired, imply you doctored evidence, or designed the Gangnam Hotel to fail deliberately. There it was. The accusation Nancy had been expecting since this began. Did I design the hotel to fail? Nancy asked calmly. Prosecutor Han studied her. Did you? I designed a complex building that required expertise and care to construct properly. I specified structural requirements that would have made it safe if followed. I documented every instance where the client compressed timelines or requested shortcuts. If Beck Siwon had hired competent contractors, followed proper procedures, and maintained quality control, that hotel would have been both beautiful and safe. That's not an answer. It's the only answer I have, Nancy said. I did my job. Beck Siwon didn't do his. That's not my fault. Prosecutor Han smiled slightly. That's good. That's the testimony I need. Can I count on you? Nancy thought about the woman she'd been 6 years ago. Young, idealistic, destroyed by a man who saw her as disposable. She thought about the 5 years she'd spent building toward this moment. The relationships cultivated, the evidence collected, the careful positioning that put her in exactly the right place at exactly the right time. She thought about justice versus revenge. Yes, Nancy said. You can count on me. The trial began in March. By then, the evidence was overwhelming. Structural engineers testified about code violations. Construction workers described being pressured to cut corners. Inspector Choi Jin-suk had taken a plea deal and testified about years of accepting bribes from Beck Development. And Nancy testified about her designs. Both sets. She brought the original files for the Hanam District project, with metadata showing she'd created every element. Showed the jury her presentation to Beck Siwon, date-stamped and documented. Then showed them Park Jin-woo's modified files, created weeks later, with large sections copied directly from her work. She explained how she'd been fired for complaining. How her career had been derailed. How she'd spent 2 years rebuilding her reputation before returning to Seoul. Beck Siwon's lawyer, expensive and aggressive, cross-examined her for 3 hours. Ms. Kim, isn't it true that you designed the Gangnam Hotel specifically to create opportunities for code violations? No. I designed a complex building that required expertise and proper execution. But you knew Beck Development had a history of cutting corners. You knew how they operated. Isn't it true you designed vulnerabilities deliberately? I designed a building that would be safe if constructed according to the specifications. If the developer chose to deviate from those specifications, that was their choice, not mine. You collected evidence for months before contacting authorities. Doesn't that suggest you wanted the violations to accumulate? That suggests I wanted comprehensive documentation before making serious accusations against a powerful developer. You have a personal vendetta against my client. You've admitted he fired you 6 years ago. This entire case is revenge. Nancy looked directly at the jury. Beck Siwon stole my work and destroyed my career. That's true. But this case isn't about my career. It's about buildings that could collapse. It's about inspections that were falsified. It's about a man who put profit over safety for 15 years. If wanting him held accountable for endangering lives is revenge, then yes, I suppose it is. But I call it justice. The lawyer tried to break her for another hour. Nancy didn't break. She'd spent 5 years preparing for this. Every question he asked, she had an answer. Every accusation, she had documentation. Every attempt to rattle her, she deflected with calm professionalism. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she caught Beck Siwon's eyes across the courtroom. He was staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Rage? Disbelief? Recognition? For the first time since this began, Nancy wondered if he remembered her. If somewhere in his mind, there was a flicker of recollection. The young designer he'd fired 6 years ago. The one whose work he'd stolen. The one he'd dismissed as disposable. Did he recognize her now? The verdict came in April. Guilty on 16 of 18 counts. The 2 acquittals were technicalities, procedural issues that didn't undermine the core findings. criminal negligence, fraud, bribery of building inspectors, intellectual property theft. Sentencing was scheduled for May. Nancy sat in the back of the courtroom and watched Baek Siwon's face as the verdicts were read. Watched the expensive suit and expensive watch and expensive smile crack and crumble. Watched him become human in a way she'd never seen before, small and frightened and real. She felt. Actually, she wasn't sure what she felt. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't satisfaction. It was something quieter, more complex. Relief, maybe? Exhaustion. The strange emptiness that comes when you've been carrying something heavy for so long that putting it down feels wrong somehow. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Nancy gave them the soundbite they wanted, calm, professional, focused on safety and accountability. Then she went home to her apartment in Yeonnam-dong. She stood in front of the wall that had held her evidence for 5 years. Photographs. Inspection reports. News articles. The map of Seoul with red pins. The photograph of Baek Siwon smiling for a magazine cover. Nancy started taking it down. Piece by piece, hour by hour. She shredded documents. Deleted encrypted files. Removed pins from the map. Threw away the photograph. By midnight, the wall was empty except for a single frame. Her architecture degree from Yonsei University. The one she'd earned 10 years ago. The one that represented who she'd been before everything went wrong. Nancy looked at it for a long time. Then she hung something next to it, a newspaper clipping from today's verdict. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. Of what she'd built herself back into. Of what she was capable of. Of the difference between destruction and accountability. Her phone buzzed. A text from Mrs. Huang, congratulations. Take tomorrow off. You've earned it. Another text, this one from Prosecutor Han. Thank you for your testimony. Justice served. A third text from Detective Park. The Gangnam Hotel is being demolished. City ordered it due to structural concerns. You probably saved lives. Sleep well. Nancy set down her phone and looked out her window at Seoul's lights. Somewhere out there, buildings she'd designed stood safe and sound. The Jeju Resort. The Seongsu Cafe. Projects where she'd been allowed to do her job properly, where integrity hadn't been compromised, where her work meant something. And somewhere out there, a building that would never be finished was being torn down. A trap that had sprung perfectly, catching exactly who it was meant to catch. Nancy didn't regret it. But she didn't celebrate it either. She just felt tired. The sentencing hearing was in May. Nancy attended, sitting in the back row, watching as Baek Siwon stood before the judge. The prosecutor recommended 8 years. The defense argued for probation and community service. The judge took 2 hours to review the case before speaking. Mr. Baek, over the course of 15 years, you systematically prioritized profit over safety. You bribed inspectors, used substandard materials, and endangered the lives of thousands of people who would have lived and worked in your buildings. When a young designer complained that you'd stolen her work, you destroyed her career to silence her. You showed no remorse, no accountability, no recognition that your actions had consequences beyond your bottom line. The judge paused, looking at Siwon over reading glasses. The court sentences you to 7 years in prison, followed by 5 years probation. You are prohibited from working in real estate development for life. You will pay restitution to Ms. Nancy Kim for intellectual property theft in the amount of 200 million won. And you will pay fines totaling 500 million won for code violations and bribery. 7 years? It was more than Nancy expected. Less than she thought he deserved. But it was something. It was accountability. It was a statement that actions have consequences, that power doesn't make you immune, that someone like Baek Siwon couldn't just destroy people and walk away. After the sentencing, Nancy walked out of the courthouse one final time. No reporters today, they'd gotten their story, moved on to the next scandal. Just Nancy in the spring air and the sound of her heels on courthouse steps for the last time. She was halfway down when she heard her name. Ms. Kim. Nancy turned. Baek Siwon stood at the top of the steps, flanked by 2 guards who would transport him to prison within the hour. His lawyer had already left. His family hadn't shown up. He stood alone in his expensive suit that would be replaced with prison clothes by evening. "You have 1 minute," one of the guards said. Siwon walked down 3 steps, close enough that Nancy could see the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair she hadn't noticed before, the way his hands shook slightly. "I remember you now," he said quietly. "The Hanam Project. You were young. Eager. You had those glasses and you always carried too many folders." Nancy said nothing. "I didn't recognize you at the Lotus Holdings meeting. You look different. You carry yourself differently." He paused. "You planned this. All of it. The documentation, the evidence, the testimony. You knew exactly what I'd do, and you set a trap. I designed a building," Nancy said evenly. "You made the choice to cut corners. You knew I would." "Yes." Siwon laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "I destroyed your career 6 years ago, and you destroyed my entire life in return. Was it worth it?" Nancy considered the question. Really considered it. Was it worth it? 5 years of planning. 5 years of careful positioning and relationship building and evidence gathering. 5 years of carrying rage like a stone in her chest. "You didn't just destroy my career," Nancy said finally. "You stole my work and called it yours. You fired me for complaining about theft. You told other firms I was unprofessional so I couldn't get hired. You took 2 years of my life while I rebuilt my reputation in Busan. You made me doubt myself, my talent, my worth. And you never once thought about what that did to me because I wasn't real to you. I was just an obstacle you removed." "I know," Siwon said, and for the first time, he sounded human. "I know what I did to you. And I know saying I'm sorry doesn't fix it. Doesn't change anything." "No," Nancy agreed. "It doesn't. But I am sorry. For what it's worth. I'm sorry I didn't see you as a person. I'm sorry I taught young designers that talent doesn't matter as much as politics. I'm sorry I built my career on cutting corners and stealing work and bribing inspectors. I'm sorry it took losing everything to realize how many people I hurt." Nancy looked at him, really looked at him. Saw a man who'd spent 15 years believing he was untouchable, and was only now understanding he was just human. Flawed and fallible and facing consequences. "I don't forgive you," Nancy said. "I'm not sure I ever will. But I believe you're sorry. And maybe that's something." "Why did you do it?" Siwon asked. "Why not just expose what I did 6 years ago? Why go through all this? The Lotus Holdings project, the documentation, the trap? Because exposing intellectual property theft from 6 years ago wouldn't have stopped you," Nancy said. "You would have paid a fine, issued an apology, and kept building dangerous buildings. You would have kept cutting corners and bribing inspectors and putting people's lives at risk. I didn't just want to punish you for what you did to me. I wanted to stop you from doing it to anyone else. So this was about justice. This was about accountability," Nancy corrected. "There's a difference." "Time's up," the guard said. Siwon nodded, started to turn away, then stopped. "That design. The Hanam Project. It really was brilliant. I knew it when I saw it. That's why I stole it." "I know," Nancy said. She watched him walk back up the courthouse steps, watched the guards lead him away, watched him disappear into the building that would process him into the prison system. Watched the moment when Baek Siwon stopped being a powerful developer and became prisoner number 2046 to 7731. Nancy stood on the courthouse steps for a long moment after he was gone. Then she pulled out her phone and made a call. "Mrs. Huang? It's Nancy. About that community center project in Mapo. The one for at-risk youth. Are they still looking for a designer?" "They are," Mrs. Huang said, sounding surprised. "But the budget is minimal. It's basically pro bono work." "That's fine," Nancy said. "I want to do it. I want to design something that matters. Something built right, with integrity, that will actually help people. Nancy, you could land major corporate projects now. After this trial, your name recognition is—" "I know," Nancy interrupted gently. "And maybe I'll do those projects too. But right now, I want to design something good. Something that reminds me why I became an architect in the first place." She hung up and walked down the courthouse steps one final time. At the bottom, she paused and looked back at the building. Justice dispensed here. Accountability enforced here. But healing? That happened somewhere else. In the quiet work of rebuilding. In the choice to create instead of destroy. In the decision to be defined by what you build, not what you tear down. Okay, beautiful people, I need to tell you something important. Drop a comment right now telling me, do you think Nancy did the right thing? Was this justice or revenge? Because I want to know what you think. Hit that like button if this story moved you, and subscribe because I have more stories about people who chose accountability over revenge, who built themselves back up after being torn down, who proved that integrity matters more than power. Stay with me because Nancy's story isn't quite over yet. 3 months later, Nancy stood in an empty lot in Mapo district, looking at architectural plans spread across a folding table. The community center was small, just 3,000 square meters, but it would have a dance studio, art rooms, a library, computer lab, and counseling offices. A place where kids who'd been dealt bad hands could find better options. Ms. Kim? Nancy looked up. A young woman stood at the edge of the lot, mid-20s, carrying a portfolio that looked held together with hope and determination. Can I help you? My name is Lee Sujin. I'm a junior designer at Hansol Architecture. I heard you were working on this project and She hesitated, then pushed forward. I wanted to ask if you needed any help. I know it's probably fully staffed, and I know I'm not experienced, but I'm willing to work for free if it means learning from you. Nancy studied her. Saw the eagerness, the hope, the desperation to prove herself. Saw herself 6 years ago. Why do you want to work with me? Nancy asked. Because you did something I'm not sure I'd have the courage to do, Sujin said. You stood up to someone powerful. You documented everything, you built a case, you testified even though you knew you'd be attacked. And you won. Not just for yourself but for everyone he hurt. I want to learn from someone like that. Nancy looked at the young woman, at the portfolio held together with tape, at the determination in her eyes. Thought about the designer she'd been. The designer she'd become. The designer she wanted to be. I don't need free labor, Nancy said. But I do need an assistant designer for this project. Standard junior designer pay, full credit on the drawings. Interested? Sujin's eyes went wide. Yes. Absolutely yes. Good. First rule, we do everything by the book. No shortcuts. No compromises on safety or integrity. If a contractor tries to substitute materials or cut corners, we shut it down immediately. This building will be done right, even if it takes longer or costs more. Understood? Understood. Second rule, every design decision, you tell me why you made it. Not what looks good or what's trendy. Why it serves the people who'll use this building. Why it makes their lives better. Why it matters. I can do that. Third rule, Nancy said, and her voice softened slightly. If someone ever tries to take credit for your work, you document everything and you fight. You don't let them erase you. You don't let them make you doubt your worth. You fight. Sujin nodded, understanding passing between them. I'll fight. Then welcome to the team, Nancy said, and handed her half the plans. Let's build something good. They worked through the afternoon, redesigning the community center's entrance to be more welcoming, adjusting the art room windows to maximize natural light, discussing materials that would be durable enough for high-traffic use but warm enough to feel inviting. As the sun set over Mapo, Nancy looked at the empty lot and saw it filled. Saw kids learning to dance. Saw teenagers discovering art. Saw young people finding counselors who cared. Saw a building that would stand for decades, safe and sound and built with integrity. Saw the future she was choosing instead of the past she'd avenged. Her phone buzzed. A text from Detective Park. FYI, Inspector Choi got 3 years. 5 more Beck development projects under investigation. Your documentation opened a lot of doors. Thank you? Nancy didn't respond. Just pocketed her phone and looked at Sujin, who was sketching ideas for the library space with the kind of enthusiasm Nancy remembered having once. You're smiling, Sujin said. Good news? Just thinking, Nancy said. About how things change. How people change. How justice doesn't fix everything, but it's a start. Do you regret it? Sujin asked suddenly. What you did to Baek Siwon. Do you regret any of it? Nancy considered the question. Did she regret spending 5 years building a trap? Did she regret the careful planning, the strategic positioning, the moment when she looked Baek Siwon in the eye and taken everything from him the way he'd taken everything from her? No, Nancy said finally. I don't regret holding him accountable. But I'm glad it's over. I'm glad I can spend my energy building instead of destroying. That's the part that matters now. Sujin nodded, and they turned back to the plans. Back to the work of creating something that would outlast both of them. Something built with integrity and care, and the belief that good design could make the world slightly better. That evening, Nancy returned to her apartment in Yeonnam-dong. The wall where she'd kept her evidence for 5 years was still mostly empty except for her degree and the newspaper clipping. But now she added something else, a sketch of the Maple Community Center. Not the final design. Just her first rough concept, drawn the day she decided to take the project. A reminder that she was more than what had been done to her. More than the woman who'd brought down Baek Siwon. More than revenge or justice or accountability. She was Nancy Kim, an architect. Designer of spaces where people lived and worked and grew. Creator of buildings that would stand long after she was gone. Someone who'd been broken and had chosen to rebuild herself into something stronger. That was her legacy. Not the courthouse verdict. Not the prison sentence. Not the empire she toppled. The buildings she designed with integrity. The young designers she mentored. The choice to create instead of destroy. That was enough. Nancy made tea and sat by her window, looking out at Seoul's lights. Somewhere out there, Baek Siwon was in prison, serving his sentence. Somewhere out there, buildings were being inspected, contractors were being held accountable, inspectors were being replaced. Somewhere out there, the industry was changing. Slowly. Imperfectly. But changing. And somewhere out there, on an empty lot in Mapo, a community center would rise. Built properly, built safely, built with care. A building that would serve at-risk youth for decades. A building that would matter. Nancy closed her eyes and let herself feel it. Satisfaction. Not triumph. Not victory. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing she'd done something that needed doing. Something hard. Something right. The designer Baek Siwon couldn't erase had become the designer who built futures instead of destroying them. And that, Nancy thought, was the best revenge of all. So what do you think, besties? Did Nancy choose justice or revenge? Was she right to set that trap, or should she have just exposed him immediately? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I want to hear your take on this. Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories about strong women who refuse to be erased, who fight back with strategy instead of violence, who choose accountability over silence. Share this with someone who needs to hear that surviving abuse makes you stronger, not weaker. That choosing integrity over shortcuts matters. That standing up to power is possible if you're patient and strategic and absolutely sure of your truth. Thank you for being here, for supporting this channel, for letting me tell stories that matter. Until next time, remember, you are not what they did to you. You are what you chose to become after. Stay strong, stay strategic, and never let anyone erase your worth. Peace and love, beautiful people.